Years ago, I met this guy. Coincidentally, the host of this podcast. And things were going well, and then out of nowhere, it was Christmas. We were still in those heady, early days of romance, and we never actually got around to talking about whether or not we would be exchanging gifts. Fortunately for him, I'm a little bit impulsive and headstrong, and he had mentioned a DVD set that had just been released. He was very keen on acquiring it. It was the Hammer Horror box set. I'm sure you know the one. So I drove on down to the local Future Shop and found the only DVD set in the city. Happily securing my prize, I marched straight to the checkout where they told me that they would not be selling me the DVDs. According to them, the barcode would not scan. The ensuing 30-minute-long kerfuffle was, in retrospect, quite amusing, but at the time I was absolutely gobsmacked that they wouldn't accept the cash I was trying so desperately to hand them. I didn't want a discount. I didn't want anything special. I just wanted to pay the price on the tag and leave. Finally, they asked me to return the next day to complete the purchase. In all honesty, I really didn't want to do that. But I did, because I knew he loved old movies.
Hello, film historians. I'm Derek and I love old movies. We've got Sam the sidekick here.
Hello, and welcome to episode 12. And since it's still October, we're going to be looking at another classic horror film.
Ooh.
This week, we cast our gaze upon Hammer's 1959 version of The Mummy, directed by Terence Fisher and starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing.
Which ties in very neatly with our cold open.
Which was Mom. That's such a crazy story.
I know. I remember when I opened the gift bag the films were in and was so surprised she had found them since I hadn't seen them in a store anywhere. And then she told me the story of what she had to go through to actually buy them.
Clearly, there's a lot about retail I don't understand.
I'm kind of old-fashioned about it. You have it for sale. I want to buy it. You take my money. I take the thing.
Yeah, that's how I imagine it going.
And yet... Well, anyway, Nikki did a great job on the cold open. She does a lot of additional research for Sam and I, filling in some of the cool little factoids we try to throw your way each week.
An unsung hero of the podcast.
Oh, for sure.
And if you would like to be a part of the show and do a cold open for us, please get in touch and let us know.
Each episode begins with a cold open where Sam or I...
Or Bill, or Mom.
Exactly. Relates a tale, a personal narrative if you will, talking about a relationship with film and our nostalgic connection to that. If you've got a story about how film really affected you in some way, we would really like to hear it.
And we'll put you on the show and let you share that story with our listeners. Maybe as soon as next week if you'd like. So get in touch pronto.
We should tell them how.
There are so many ways.
You can find us on the Facebook.
I Love Old Movies, the podcast.
Or the Instagram.
I Love Old Movies, the podcast.
Or you could send us an email.
I Love Old Movies, the podcast @gmail.com.
All one word.
And you know what? We don't take enough time to thank you guys, our listeners, for checking us out. So totally thanks.
Totally thanks. I mean, we hear the advice from other podcasters. Don't worry about your numbers. Just do it for fun. All that stuff. But really, at the end of the day, we are trying to create a product that people will like. And I am pretty comfortable saying that at this point, 11 episodes in, we have a small but pretty dedicated following of listeners. And that is really cool for us.
And it's growing all the time, so stick with us. We're going to keep trying to get better, too. And you know we're always going to talk about cool films.
In fact...
Oh, right.
We should probably mention that we are going to try something for a bit and see how it goes. We've been using October and its connection with scary things to cover horror films all month, and we're realizing that we kind of like the idea of having some theme months. So we're going to try this out. After our last October episode...
Which is next week.
Wow. That is moving fast.
Right?
Well, after that, we will have a theme for November, and then for December.
We will announce the themes on our socials when we get closer to the date.
If the theme idea is something you guys like, we will stick with it in 2022. But let's take it on a test ride for a bit and see how it goes. Definitely let us know.
And while you're letting us know, please take a moment to hit like, subscribe, and share.
It is the cool thing to do.
And we appreciate it.
Absolutely we do. So, The Mummy. Should we drop the hammer on this one and get underway?
Don't even start with that stuff.
Our director is Terence Fisher. Fisher joined the Merchant Navy at the age of 16 and after 5 years realized that living out at sea was not for him. So after leaving the Marines and starting to look for work, he got a job in the film industry, first as a clapper boy in 1933. He ended up becoming a film editor, and his first official work was in 1934 at J. Arthur Studios. He got his first credit for Tudor Rose in 1936 and went on to do editing work at Gainsborough Pictures and Warner Brothers. Fisher's first directing credit was in 1948 with the film A Song for Tomorrow, and he went on to work with various studios as a director. In 1956, Hammer Studios asked Fisher to work with them on a remake of 1931's Frankenstein, resulting in giving us The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957, which set a new standard for horror movies at the time. Most of his work centered around different horror films, as that was his preferred genre. Later on, he made The Horror of Dracula, which was considered to be Fisher's and Hammer's greatest work. He died in 1980 at the age of 76.
Our writer is Jimmy Sangster. He got his start in the film industry working as a production assistant at the age of 16 during World War II. Afterwards, he did various jobs working as an assistant projectionist, film magazine loader, and clapper boy. Being drafted into the RAF put his career on hold for a few years, but Sangster was able to get back into the swing of things by 1949, as he got himself a job with Exclusive Studios, which later became Hammer Studios. He began working as an assistant director until he eventually gave screenwriting a shot. His first script, X the Unknown, in 1956, kick-started his screenwriting career. He then went on to write scripts such as The Curse of Frankenstein from 1957 and Dracula in 1958, and he even wrote some scripts for competing studios, such as Blood of the Vampire in 1958 and Crawling Eye from the same year. He then briefly wrote some psychological thrillers, and later directed a few films for Hammer, which were considered commercial disappointments. By the early 1970s, Sangster moved to Hollywood and wrote scripts for films and television series such as The Legacy in 1978 and The Night Stalker in 1974. He died in 2011 at the age of 83.
Appearing in 24 films together, co-starring in many of those, the team of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing is one of cinema's all-time greatest pairings. Lee entered film work after his time as an intelligence agent in World War II,
where he served with Ian Fleming and may or may not have been the real-life inspiration of the James Bond character.
And Cushing took a more traditional approach, doing substantial work in theater before transitioning to film. Beginning with Hamlet in 1948, the two appeared in 3 films together without really being connected or even acquainted. It wasn't until making The Curse of Frankenstein, co-starring with one another, that their close relationship, both on screen and in real life, began to bloom. That on-screen partnership lasted until their final film, House of the Long Shadows, in 1983, which also starred Vincent Price, and gave us a steady diet of Lee as a monster opposed by Cushing as the intrepid hero. Ironically, though both made their careers on the back of their appearances in numerous horror films, neither man was a fan of the genre. And yet, so iconic were their portrayals, and so known were they as an on-screen team, eventually it came to pass that films could be marketed exclusively on the fact that they were in it.
That's some big-time renown. And they're both connected to Star Wars, which is incredible. I saw both these guys in films before I really knew who either one was.
Oh, for sure. Cushing's career had begun to significantly diverge from Lee's when he played Grand Moff Tarkin in the original Star Wars film, which wasn't called Episode 4 back in those days. And Lee was in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith as Count Dooku, both made after Cushing's death. So not a shared appearance, but it's neat that they both found their way into one of the biggest film franchises of all time.
That's so cool.
The two shared a formula, tending to either co-star in a film, or if one was more clearly the star, the other was his co-star, and typically they were adversaries. Cushing's Dr. Frankenstein to Lee's Monster, Cushing's Van Helsing to Lee's Dracula, and so on.
It's amazing to think that they were always at each other's throats in the movies, but in real life, were the very best of friends.
Oh, that's so true. I can't begin to summarize their respective careers here, so I just really want to stress how their shared body of work is so vast and seminal, particularly in the horror genre, but perhaps the best thing I read about them while researching this episode was an article by Carrie O'Shea at warperspective.com called The Gentlest and Most Generous of Men, The Friendship of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. In it she writes, "If Cushing was the quintessential English gent, then his friendship with Lee would seem to be the quintessential friendship between gentlemen. Cushing the more pacific character to Lee's braviloquence, but together a brilliantly matched, deeply attached amity." Go read the whole article. I'll link it in the profile for you. It's really good.
Multilingual French-born actress Yvonne Furneaux enjoyed an eclectic career on film, primarily in the 1950s and 60s. Never a Hollywood performer, she made films in England, France, Italy, West Germany, and Spain, across a wide range of genres from romance to horror to war to comedy, and so on. Despite her wide range and her opportunities working with some of Europe's best directors, like Antonioni, Fellini, and even Polanski in Repulsion, Furneaux was not a huge star, and made more than her share of films that simply flew under the radar or were of low quality. She married in the late 1960s, and she subsequently appeared in less and less productions, until her final film, Frankenstein's Great Aunt Tilly, in 1984. Furneaux was long retired, but still alive at 94, a surviving link to a completely different era of filmmaking.
Part of the Hammer Films movement in the late 1950s to recreate the magic of the original Universal horror films, The Mummy is not a direct remake of the 1932 original. Plot-wise, it is better described as a mashup of The Mummy's Hand and The Mummy's Tomb.
No love for the mummy's ghost. Never any love for the mummy's ghost.
Well, that's probably fair. You remember how it went with Ghost of Frankenstein?
Oh, you mean the movie we did a podcast on, and it's our most popular and listened to episode by far?
That would be the one, yes.
I'm just saying, ghosts might be the golden ticket.
Okay, fair enough. But with the title of one film and cribbing plot notes from two others, the Hammer film seemed like something new. And being filmed in Technicolor gave moviegoers a look at the classic mummy creature that they certainly had not seen before.
He looks great.
And they knew they had a winning formula by this point. Christopher Lee is the monster, Peter Cushing is the hero, and very vivid and modern-looking presentation. And yet, despite that formula working well for Dracula and Frankenstein, with both of those films generating many sequels, and in fact, very legitimate franchises, The Mummy, not so much.
Was it not well received?
Well, not exceptionally. Many critics at the time, while conceding the visual beauty of the film, came down hard on the wordy, exposition-heavy script and what they called the, quote, wooden directing. Variety magazine referred to the technical aspects as being, quote, excellently executed, but had little praise for the overall product. My favorite quote about the film comes from a book called The Hammer Story, the authorized history of Hammer films, where authors Marcus Hearn and Alan Barnes called it, quote, structurally little more than a string of picturesque and nicely lit killings. The Mummy's melancholic presentation and romantic undertow grants it a certain atmosphere which elevates this bandaged brute far beyond its cinematic predecessors.
Okay, the last part of that sounds like praise. Not so sure about the first part.
Right? Now, what's interesting is even though Hammer had already made Curse of Frankenstein and Horror of Dracula by this point, they hadn't actually reached an agreement with Universal to do so. And this is why the character designs in particular for the monsters was very different from what the viewers were used to. Basically, they had to stay as far away from the Jack Pierce look as possible, since Universal was already threatening with lawsuits.
That makes sense. And Christopher Lee looked way different from the classics in both those films.
But by the time The Mummy came out, an agreement to share the use of the intellectual property had been reached. And this was huge, since it allowed Hammer to use a far more recognizable and iconic look for The Mummy, as well as use the name that audiences would associate with the character, Charis.
Right.
There was a sequel, in 1964, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, but considering it had neither Lee nor Cushing in it, that tells you how far down Hammer's priority list it was.
Yes, it does. Especially since those two were in almost everything.
So, what is the tail of the tape on this one, Sam?
We have a 6.7 on IMDb. The audience score is 64% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the tomato meter is 89%. The film won no awards. And for this one, you're going to have to head over to your local secondhand DVD store.
We open on title cards, and that sort of vaguely exotic music that movies like this always seem to have. The action is taking place in 1895 at an archaeological dig somewhere in Egypt. The father-son dig team of Stephen and John Banning, along with Uncle Joe, and their huge crew of locals is hard at work. Some artifact is instantly found, and it is identified as the badge of the Karnak Guards.
John Banning is recovering from a broken leg. Stephen and Joe want to send him back to see a doctor or he might be crippled for life. They're looking for the tomb of Ananka, and John has no intention of leaving.
The tomb is found, and just when they go to enter the tomb, some local named Bay shows up to beg them not to go in. He warns of gravest danger and consequences. Stephen Banning is like, "Are you from the government? No? F off."
It's pretty dismissive.
Well, they had permits.
Oh, well then.
The tomb has skeletons strewn about, and that seems unlikely for an undisturbed tomb. In fact, it looks very clean and tidy in here, except for the strewn about skeletons.
Why is there already light in the room?
This is totally Ananka's tomb. Stephen finds a weird relic known as the Scroll of Life, and when he's left alone in the tomb, Stephen is heard screaming and then is found in a near catatonic state.
What happened?
6 months later, the dig is still going on, but Stephen is in an asylum and has gotten no better. John has concluded that the tomb is evil, and now that he's done there, they dynamite it.
Right, after it's been fully looted. Now it's evil.
Well, he's an archaeologist, not an ethicologist.
We get a needlessly long shot of the fuse burning. Slowly burning.
I was going to say that things are moving along quickly with that 6-month time jump, but...
Not that fuse.
No.
Why didn't they just make it an inch long if it burns that slow?
Right?
They'll be back in England by the time this thing blows.
Anyway, eventually, kaboom. And now it's 3 years later, and Stephen has been asking to see John. John promptly visits, and Stephen explains how the Scroll of Life animated a mummy that attacked him when he was alone in the tomb, and it wants to kill them all for the desecration they committed. John believes none of this.
But wait, where's the scroll? What happened to it?
We see that Bay is also in England, and a cart filled with his Egyptian relics crashes into a swamp and sinks. He prays to Karnak, and it turns out that he has the scroll. He reads it, the swamp starts bubbling, and up comes the mummy.
Horus the mummy is told to go destroy the unbelievers who gazed upon Ananka's face. He's a bit unsteady on his feet, but off he goes. And his first stop is to Stephen's asylum. The mummy breaks in and one hand strangles him.
Why didn't he just kill him the first time they met 3 years ago?
Well, yeah. But I love that he used a terror attack that caused permanent insanity. That's a good secondary power.
Well, you can't strangle everyone.
The authorities think some murderous maniac killed him, but John isn't satisfied. He feels that something must have motivated this killing. So he and Joe go through all of Stephen's files.
In a huge folio, they do some research. Wait a minute. The mummy, the Scroll of Life. I wonder if that's connected somehow. Well, that is some top-notch deductive reasoning by John. And as they read about Ananka, we get a huge flashback.
Princess Ananka was a high priestess of Karnak. She died on a pilgrimage and underwent the mummification process, while her doting high priest, Karis, made a bunch of very important sounding speeches. Karis ordered a tomb to be built for her on the spot, rather than have her returned home.
We get a long description of the funeral. And then the guards kill the slaves and the handmaidens, all as part of the ritual and to protect the secrecy of the tomb. But after everything, Kara snuck back into the tomb with the scroll of life. He opens the sarcophagus, intending to reanimate her. It turns out that the princess and Karis had a forbidden love.
That's the worst kind of love. Everyone knows that.
Well, not Karis. And he had no problem with committing the ultimate blasphemy in the name of their love. But he gets caught, and they cut his tongue out.
And buried alive.
And also kind of mummified alive.
And put into a little box in the tomb.
Well, that's it for him then.
The flashback ends and we see Bey in his sweet mansion home, filled with Egyptian treasures. Oh, and the mummy lives there.
This is going to be bad for Uncle Joe.
But while Karis goes to commit the next revenge murder, some old rummy sees the mummy on the roadside.
Not the most reliable witness.
The mummy bursts in and kills Joe. John tries to fight back, but it's too late, and his mightiest pistol shots have little to no effect.
The police do not believe any of this. The inspector completely pish-poshes the idea of a bandaged, wrapped, unstoppable monster. The inspector interviews witnesses, including the rummy, and that doesn't really help things.
Oh, and we get another flashback. It's basically the start of the movie again, with Joe and Stephen opening the tomb. Stephen read the scroll when Joe left, and that activated Karis. Bey showed up.
Wait, how did he get by everyone?
And led Karis off. He also took the scroll and left Stephen a quivering mess of terror and insanity.
All that having been revealed, John now completely believes the story and accepts that the mummy is out to get them. The police, not so much.
But it's too late. Karis is sent to kill John. This happens right at the same moment that John realizes that his wife looks just like Ananka.
Oh, well, there's a coincidence.
John expects an attack, so he loads up the old shotgun.
Okay, I love how when it was his uncle being killed, he went for the tiny pistol. But now that it's him, he gets the biggest gun he has.
I don't even like John.
The mummy attacks, and he completely no-sells the shotgun blasts. Kara starts killing John, but then he sees Isabel, and I guess he remembers Ananka. And we get this sad, lovelorn humanity in the eyes of Karis, and he just wanders off. Now, Bey assumes the last killing is done, so he puts Karis to bed and prepares to return home. But John goes to Bey's house, and a clever little cat and mouse game goes on between them. They have an ethical debate about tomb openings and the pillaging of artifacts from Egypt for the benefit of the British Museum.
As if this isn't awkward enough, the discussion turns to religion, and John says, Karnak was a third-rate god.
Ooh.
And then the threats start up. From Bey.
This is a really long scene between two pretty despicable guys.
Really long.
Did we mention how long it is?
It seemed longer.
All the points Bey made about tomb raiding, that's all spot on. He's not wrong. His plan to combat it with revenge murder performed by a supernatural undead creature, that's a bit much though.
You can agree with the thought process and not the actions. Anyway, this all leads to Bey planning one final attack on John to end this once and for all.
The police protect the Banning home while they try to round up an angry mob to help catch the killer.
Yes, an angry mob!
The rummy is one of the people standing guard, and he gets killed by Bey. The inspector hides Isabel outside the house in a bush.
Where he then abandons her.
Again, this is in a bush.
More of a shrub, really.
Probably the safest shrub they had on the grounds.
Doubtless.
Karis clubs the inspector, and Bey stabs another police constable. They've really killed their way through John's defenses.
That bush doesn't look so safe now, huh?
The mummy attacks John and is killing him with his patented one-handed choke. Isabel again shows up, calling for the attack to stop.
Karis sees Ananka in Isabel. Bey wants her killed, but Karis is like, nah. And then the mummy kills Bey before taking Isabel and wandering off with her.
Not much loyalty there. I guess the scroll of life isn't the same as the scroll of control.
You'd want both, ideally. Still, live by the mummy, die by the mummy.
John and the inspector, who has recovered nicely, pursue Karis, and he shambles away with Isabel in his arms.
I guess she was safer in the bush.
Karis takes her into the swamp where the buggy had crashed with all of Bey's stuff, and he wanders into it.
The angry mob has assembled and is in pursuit. And once Isabel is clear, they all shoot Karis. And his shotgun blast-riddled body sinks into the swamp, taking the scroll of life with him.
Wait, when did he get that?
It's better this way.
I mean, I guess.
So, that was a movie we just watched.
Ugh. Well, not one of our better choices. Can we just pro and con this thing and put it to bed?
Yup.
Okay, my pros. Number 1, the ethical debate about English archaeologists taking artifacts from other countries for the benefits of their museums was a very strong, if long, scene. It perfectly represented the argument that has been raging for over 100 years and put Bay's perspective into terms that the audience could empathize with. Sadly, it's after this moment that he descends into full-out supervillainy, taking a more personal hand in the murders of the rummy and the police constable. Number 2, the Technicolor presentation was great. The sets and costumes were lavish and colorful, and the mummy in particular looked fantastic. While the bright presentation lacked the gloominess of the black and white predecessors, the rich color film would have been a real treat for viewers in 1959, seeing a classic film monster in the most vivid terms imaginable. And number 3, it's a Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing film. That gives it an automatic pro. My cons. Despite it being a Christopher Lee Peter Cushing film, the two don't have much to do together other than tussle. While that's understandable given the nature of a mummy film, it still can't help but feel like a bit of a letdown. The lack of likable characters is my second con. It's hard to get too behind John Banning. He has an aloof, self-righteous manner to him that doesn't exactly appeal to an audience, and likewise Bay is just flat-out murderous. We know that Karras is a selfish blasphemer with no respect for even his own customs, and the scoffing inspector just seems purposely obtuse. Who do we root for in this movie? It's not enough to say that the monsters are the bad guys and everyone else is the good guy. You either have to side with the grave robbers and the piracy of cultural artifacts, or you have to side with ritualistic revenge murderers. That's a hard choice for an audience to have to make. And number 3, the runtime. I don't think I've ever watched a longer 87-minute film. The film is so unevenly paced and has long scenes with nothing but exposition. It makes for a fairly dull film overall, and it only really perks up when Karras arrives to smash through a door and kill someone. The film feels decompressed, in the sense that they had a script that would fill an hour or less of film, but needed to draw it out to feature length. The result is a movie that is not nearly as good as the Hammer, Frankenstein, and Dracula films that preceded it. That this movie spawned 3 sequels is unbelievable. That neither Lee nor Cushing agreed to appear in any of them is not.
And is this a watch or not?
This is a not watch. Seriously, if you want to see The Mummy in color, just download some screen caps and enjoy. And if you want to see a good mummy film, stick with some of the Universal films. This one is just too illogical and frankly too dull to dedicate your time to. If you're a Hammer completionist, then by all means, enjoy it. But for the casual viewer, I'd never recommend this. You're up.
Okay, so my pros. 1. The inspector. I just found the guy kind of funny. At first he was like, there's absolutely no mummy running about. And then like 2 scenes later, he was all, oh yeah, it's definitely a mummy. He just accepted it and moved on really quickly. It was weird, but I found it pretty funny how relaxed he was about the whole thing. 2. The secret door in Ananka's tomb. It was a pretty interesting setup. I like how it incorporated the scroll of life and how the sand poured and weighed the door down. It was kind of cool. It did seem pretty advanced for the time though, considering it was set up in the tomb of an ancient mummy. But still, I liked it. 3. Karras. So yeah, probably not the best mummy I've ever seen. Like, he was really big, he walked funny, and he only ever killed people by choking them with his left hand. But what can I say? I'm a sucker for the classic movie monsters. He looked really cool, and after coming out of the swamp, he was all muddy, and he looked great. My cons. 1. The time skips. Everything really moved quickly at the beginning of the film, and it felt pretty rushed. And honestly, the pace was super disorienting for me. It looked like it was just the next day, but then all of a sudden they're talking about how it's 6 months later. And then right after that, it's a 3-year time skip. I was starting to get worried that they were going to have some huge time skips in every scene. 2. The flashback scenes. They were just so painfully dull. And why did there have to be 2 of them? I feel like they could have easily just talked about the information they wanted to instead of those ridiculous flashbacks. They dragged on and on. It was honestly pretty tiring just trying to pay attention to those parts. 3. Everyone getting knocked out or killed. The police officer, the inspector, and the random drunk guy who was with them for some reason were absolutely useless. They all got knocked out or killed by Karis and Bay in like 5 seconds. Why were they even there if they were going to be taken out of the fight instantly? It just felt like a waste of time.
Yeah. And is this one a watch for you?
I was going back and forth on this, but then I remembered literally any other Mummy movie, and I would say just watch one of those instead. This is going to have to be a not watch.
There we go. Okay, so there you have it. And with everything out of the way, I guess we can call this episode a wrap.
No.
Because mummies...
No.
Just with their bandages and everything?
Stop it!
Fine. We will be back next week with our last scary movie episode before starting up with our November theme. Keep watching our socials for details on that. And perhaps I could just mention, if anyone out there listening enjoyed this podcast, be sure not to keep it to yourself.
That's for sure. We won't mind it at all if you help spread the word about our podcast.
We are not a secret.
So tell your friends.
Tell your enemies.
You never know. They just might want to get wrapped up in a good Mummy movie as much as you do.
Maybe even... Hey. For Sam the Sidekick, I'm Derek, and I love old movies. Additional research for I Love Old Movies, the podcast, is done by Nikki Weatherden. Audio clips come from prefx.co.uk. Images are used through the provisions of fair use, and our theme song, Burning Bridges, is by The Crocs.